Hi, welcome back to another pivot table tutorial. In this video, we're going to cover how to create dashboards that let you or your audience interact with the data. We're going to create one simple version and one that's more advanced, which brings it all together. Now, Microsoft Excel may not be the most polished software for dashboard development, but it does offer some really great features to get you started without having to purchase new software. Now, at this point, it is important to make sure you format your data as a table, as we explained earlier. That way, any changes you make to the tables automatically update your pivot charts. All right, let's push off from shore and wade into creating our first dashboard. So we're going to start with our source data, and we'll insert a new pivot table. And for rows, we're going to use the number of days of EI services. And for columns, we're going to use the progress categories for the social emotional outcome. And for values, we will simply use the count of child ID. And we'll make sure to right-click and summarize values by a count. Now I'm going to show you a bonus example of how to group numerical or date-based labels in preparation for a dashboard. So let's try to group these a bit more. So let's right-click on any one of the values on the left and click Group. And you can see it's showing the entire range from 181 days to 1095 days. And Excel in this case defaulted to by 100. So let's see what that looks like. Okay, we've still got probably too many groups to be useful in our dashboard. And also notice what's happening. The last number in the last range, 1180, doesn't actually correspond to the end range, which is 1095. We know that from looking at our data earlier. So let's try to dial this in a little bit more. We'll have to guess a little bit here, but let's try grouping by 183 days. There we go. That's a little more reasonable. We only have 5 different groups to work with, which is a good summary of our data ranges. And it ends precisely at 1095 days. Okay, so let's go ahead and insert a pivot chart. So we'll go up to our Insert tab and make sure you've clicked inside the pivot table and go up to Pivot Chart and click Pivot Chart. And once again, you'll have a number of options to choose from, but we're going to stick to the column charts again. All right, and now we have a nice layout with 5 different bins of data. And within each of those bins, we have our categories A through E represented by these different colors. So let's see what happens if we insert a slicer. If you recall, a slicer is essentially an interactive filter. So let's add a slicer for gender. And we can pull this down here. We might resize our box. And we might change our slicer style to something like this color. And we can see now if we click this, now we've got a very basic dashboard in place already just from building a pivot chart and adding one slicer. You can see as I click male and female, the chart and the pivot table both update simultaneously, so it's all interconnected. Also, watch what happens if I swap out one of the columns in our pivot table. So let's say instead of looking at the social emotional outcome, we wanted to look at the progress categories for knowledge and skills. So we'll come down here and grab that, pull it into the columns, and lickety split, everything updated automatically just from swapping that out. All right, so we have completed our first very basic dashboard. Congratulations. Now let's really ramp this up and bring it all together with a more advanced dashboard that has a lot of our best practices, our design enhancements, and even multiple pivot charts at this point. And we can also insert slicers that control everything across the dashboard. So let's say that we wanted to replicate this dashboard here so that it has charts for not just one outcome, but all 3 child outcomes: social emotional, knowledge and skills, and use of appropriate behaviors to meet needs. I'm going to remove our slicer for now, and we'll add some of these back in later. You'll see how this tab essentially becomes a staging area for our main dashboard, which is not necessary, but it's a good way in my experience to track your steps and keep things organized. And to that end, we're going to also rename our sheet to something like OC for outcome dashboard staging. Now I'm going to start duplicating my pivot tables for the other outcomes. So let's grab this pivot table and I will paste in 2 of these. And then I'm going to go into my second dashboard and I'm going to pivot out the knowledge and skills outcome and insert the social emotional progress categories there, and do the same for the other outcome in my third table. So we'll go all the way down and grab the progress categories for behavior to meet needs. And I'll zoom out so you can see this all together. My next step is to replicate my pivot charts for these new pivot tables. So once again, we'll go to Insert, Pivot Chart. There's my second pivot chart. And then in my third and final pivot table, I will make my pivot chart. Now I'm also going to add some labels to my charts so I don't get them confused. So I will add a chart element. And in here, this will be knowledge and skills. In here, it will be social emotional. And in here, I will add appropriate behaviors to meet needs. Great. So I have all 3 of my charts ready to go. Now I'm going to create a separate worksheet for my dashboard. So we'll go ahead and add a new worksheet. Call that my dashboard. And I'm going to simply select all 3 of my charts, copy those, and paste them into my dashboard. And I'm going to move them around so that they are laid out horizontally. So you can see where we're headed. Now we've got the beginnings of a more intricate dashboard with our 3 pivot charts. Now I'm going to make even more formatting and design enhancements. So let's pull all 3 of these down a little bit. And up top, I'm going to add a title, something like Child Outcomes Progress Categories by Days of EI Service. Maybe I'll bump up the font size. And let's select the entire background and insert a nice light blue background. Okay, so we get rid of our grid lines. We can start to see this looks more appropriate for a dashboard format. Now we're getting really close. And at this point, I want to insert several slicers to make this really interactive. So let's click somewhere inside one of my pivot tables and go up to the Insert Slicer option. And let's say that I wanted to add a few slicers. Maybe I want to look at this by gender, race, ethnicity, setting, and perhaps EI program. So we can check all 4 of those. Great, so now I've got all the slicers that I want to start adding. Let's drag these toward the bottom and line them up. Okay. I'm going to resize this one, and this one, and this one. And maybe I want multiple columns for my EI box. So I'll choose that option. The color looks okay against this light blue background, so I'm going to leave those alone. Now, before I start setting up my report connections between all of the pivot tables and all of the slicers, I need to actually make sure that I've renamed my pivot tables in the staging worksheet to make sure that their names show up appropriately in my report connections, and I know I'm connecting the right pivot tables. So let's right-click in the first pivot table and go down to Pivot Table Options, and we'll name this Knowledge and Skills, and we'll add the word chart just to make sure we're distinguishing from other worksheets that may have similar names. I'll do the same thing for the next pivot table. Social emotional chart will be my label for that one. And for my last pivot table, Again, this is linked to the third chart down here. This will become behavior to meet needs chart. Okay, let's go back to our dashboard and set up our report connections. Again, to do this, you right-click on any one of the slicers, go to Report Connections. Let's expand this box so we can see them all together. And you can see these 3 pivot charts and the linked pivot tables need to be selected so that everything changes dynamically together. So we'll check those 3 boxes and select OK. Okay, let's bring our dashboard title back so we can see it all together. I also need to set up my report connections for all the other slicers. So we're going to do exactly the same thing and check the 3 boxes in this box. And we'll do the same thing for setting, and lastly, the same thing for EI program name. Now, for my end users, I want to make the labels for EI program and race ethnicity on the slicers to appear without the underscore. So to do that, I can right-click on the slicer and go to Slicer Settings. And under this section here that says Header, for the caption, I just want to remove the underscore. And I'll do the same thing for EI program. Let's call this one EI program name. And away we go. Here's your very own Excel pivot table based dashboard. You can see as I click through on all the various filters and slicers, things are really starting to whittle down. You can see they dynamically control all 3 of my pivot charts. In some cases, I'm drilling down too far to be meaningful, but you get the idea. So there's a lot you can do both inside Excel and with other software when it comes to dashboards, but this might be enough to suit your purpose in many cases. Also, be sure to check out our resources section for this video series, where we feature a few videos that show some really neat, sophisticated features of Excel-based dashboards.